His hands were always cold when they closed my bedroom door. That's how I learned that evil doesn't need fire to burn a good soul. His hands were always cold when they closed my bedroom door. That's how I learned that the devil doesn't need fire to burn a soul. Good morning, my dears. I'm Betty Johnson, 83 years old, with a story I've kept silent about for most of my life. I'm speaking to you from my modest home in Millbrook, a small town in rural Virginia, where the mountains hide as many secrets as people's hearts. Before I begin this difficult journey, I want to thank you for being here with me. It's a blessing to share this after so many years. If you could, please leave a comment saying where you're watching from. It warms this old woman's heart to know my words are reaching so many different places. And please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button so others can hear this story too. A story that, unfortunately, remains the reality for many girls across America. I was born in 1940, in a time when children had no voice. We were to be seen, not heard, as my mother used to say. Our house was a simple wooden structure with a dirt floor in the early years, later covered with smooth cement that my father managed to put in with help from the neighbors. We had a humble but dignified life, like many rural families back then. My father worked in the fields, leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. My mother found work as a laundress at the Wilsons' estate. They owned nearly everything around there. She would leave right after him, carrying bundles of laundry in her arms, trudging up and down those red clay hills that turned slippery during the rainy season. I was 7 when my grandfather Jerome came to live with us, my father's father, a man who carried the Bible under his arm and sharp verses on the tip of his tongue. He had become a widower, and as my mother said, a man doesn't know how to take care of himself. So they set up a small room for him at the back of our house, the one that used to be the tool shed. It's a blessing to have Mr. Jerome here, my mother would say. He can watch Betty while we're gone, and he helps with the expenses. At first, it really did seem like a blessing. Grandpa Jerome would tell me Bible stories that fascinated me. David and Goliath, Noah and his ark, Moses parting the sea. He had a way of telling them that made everything seem magical and important. And when he spoke of Jesus, his eyes shone in a way that I thought was true faith. Back then, I would go to school in the morning, leaving with my father and mother, my little notebook under my arm, my patched uniform always clean and pressed. I'd return around 11 o'clock, and Grandpa Jerome would be there waiting with lunch ready, usually beans with rice, and on good days, a sausage or a piece of dried meat. It was gradually that things began to change, so slowly that I hardly noticed when his gaze began to weigh on me like a wet coat. I was 12 when I had to leave school, not by choice. My father had fallen ill, pneumonia that kept him bedridden for weeks, and money became even tighter. The solution was for me to stay home full-time, helping with chores while my mother doubled her hours at the Wilsons to make up for what my father could no longer bring in. "You'll stay with your grandfather. He'll teach you about God." "That's better than any school," my mother said, arranging my hair with those rough hands from so much scrubbing. And so began my ordeal. My parents would leave together, my father, though weak, trying to work lighter jobs, and I would stay alone with Grandpa Jerome from 6 in the morning until almost 2 in the afternoon, when my mother could get a break to come prepare lunch. At first, it was just comments. "That skirt isn't appropriate for a young lady from a good family. That loose hair is an invitation to sin. You need to button up that dress more, girl." Always with that soft voice, that tone of someone who's just looking out for my soul. Then came the forced catechism lessons. Hours sitting at the kitchen table reciting verses, copying passages from the Bible. If I got a word wrong, if my handwriting wasn't perfect, if I dared to yawn from tiredness, punishment was certain. "On your knees, Betty," he would say, pointing to the rough cement floor. "That's how you speak to God when you've committed a sin." Initially, the punishments were kneeling for 15 minutes, praying the Our Father and Hail Mary non-stop. Over time, 15 minutes became 30, then an hour. The cement scraped my knees until they bled, but I couldn't cry. Crying was a sign of weakness, a way to let the devil in. There were days when he forced me to kneel with my arms outstretched like Christ on the cross. If my arms lowered even an inch, the time would start over. My legs trembled, my arms hurt as if they were about to break, but I couldn't show weakness. "It's for your own good," he would say, sitting in the rocking chair, watching me with eyes that were no longer a grandfather's, but something I couldn't name. It's to cleanse your soul of sin. What was my sin? I didn't know. Being a girl, growing up, existing? At 13, my body began to change, and with it, the sins that Grandpa Jerome saw in me multiplied. One day he caught me combing my hair in front of the small cracked mirror we had in the living room. "Vanity," he growled, yanking the comb from my hand with such force that some strands of hair came with it. "Do you know what the Bible says about vain women? They are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, full of rot within." That afternoon, the punishment was different. I was forced to kneel on corn kernels, hard, pointy grains digging into the tender skin of my knees. And while I silently cried, biting my lips not to scream, he read passages about Eve's fall, about how woman brought sin into the world. "Repeat after me," he ordered. "I am the cause of sin. I am temptation. My body is an instrument of the devil." And I repeated, the words coming out between choked sobs, my knees bleeding, my soul breaking a little more with each forced syllable. After that day, the rituals became more frequent, more elaborate. He said he saw the devil in me, that he needed to cast it out, that it was his divine mission to save me from myself. When my breasts began to show beneath my blouses, he forced me to wear tight bands to hide them. "Instruments of perdition," he would mutter, his eyes fixed precisely where they shouldn't be. The band hurt, cut off my breathing, left red marks on my skin that burned for days. At 14, I had my first period. Frightened, not really understanding what was happening, I ran to my mother, who had come home early that day. She explained briefly with practical, direct words, gave me some cloths to use, and said that now I was a young woman and needed to be even more careful. I don't know how, but Grandpa Jerome found out. Perhaps he saw the cloths hanging on the clothesline out back. Perhaps he overheard my conversation with my mother. That night, while my parents slept, exhausted from work, he entered the small room I shared with my younger siblings. "Come with me," he whispered, pulling me by the arm with such force that it left purple bruises in the days that followed. "We need to cleanse this sin from you." He took me to the kitchen, where the only light came from a candle he had already lit on the table. The Bible open to Leviticus, to those passages about the impurity of women during their period. "On your knees," he ordered, his voice different, lower, almost a hiss. I obeyed, trembling with fear and cold. It was July. Nights in Millbrook could be freezing. The floor was so cold it seemed to burn. "You now carry the mark of Eve," he said, circling the table, the candle casting monstrous shadows on the walls of our poor kitchen. "Your body is a source of sin. You are a walking temptation, a devil's trap for good men." And then the ritual began. Me, on my knees, having to repeat horrible phrases about myself, that I was impure, that my body was dirty, that I carried Eve's curse, that it was my fault if men had sinful thoughts. "Louder," he demanded when my voice faltered. "God needs to hear your repentance." Then came the part that terrified me the most. He would place his hands on my head, pray in a strange language, and then force me to ask forgiveness. Not from God, from him, for tempting him. "You tempt me with this body of perdition," he would say, his voice trembling in a way that only years later I would understand. "Ask forgiveness for making me have impure thoughts. It's your fault, your responsibility." And I would ask, silently crying, tears falling onto the cold floor, mixing with the blood from my bruised knees. I would ask forgiveness for something I hadn't done, for a crime I hadn't committed, for existing. This ritual was repeated for years, not just during my periods, but for any sin he invented. If I smiled at the neighbor's son, if I hummed a song that wasn't religious, if I took too long in the bath, anything was reason enough. My parents didn't notice, or pretended not to. They were always so tired, so worried about putting food on the table, that they didn't see the bruises on my arms, didn't notice how I had stopped smiling, how I would shrink when Grandpa Jerome entered the room. At 15, I began having terrible nightmares. I dreamed of demons chasing me, of hell opening beneath my feet, of God rejecting me at the final judgment. I would wake up screaming, sweating, to find Grandpa Jerome standing at my bedroom door, watching. "See," he would say, It's your guilty conscience, your body full of sin. And off we would go, in the middle of the night, for another purification ritual. On my knees, praying, asking forgiveness for sins I hadn't committed, for thoughts I never had, for desires that weren't mine. It was during this time that I began to doubt God. What God would allow a girl to suffer like this? What God would let a man use his name to terrorize a child? What God would remain silent in the face of my desperate prayers for help? But I couldn't express these doubts. Doubting was the worst sin, Grandpa Jerome said. Doubting was shaking hands with the devil. So I pretended to believe, pretended to repent, pretended to accept that I deserved those punishments. It was the only way to survive. One night, when I was almost 16, something different happened. Grandpa Jerome woke me in the middle of the night, as he had so many times before, dragged me to the kitchen for another of his rituals. But this time his eyes were different. There was something in them that chilled me to the core. "Today you will learn what happens to girls who provoke men of God," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper that still echoes in my nightmares. That's when I knew the ritual would be different. That the forced prayers, the bleeding knees on the cold floor, the verbal humiliations wouldn't be the end that night. They would just be the beginning. And as I knelt, trembling not just from cold, but from absolute terror, I prayed. Not the mechanical prayers he forced me to repeat, but a true, desperate plea from the depths of my soul. "God," I silently begged, tears streaming down my face, "if you are there, if you are real, save me. Any way you can, just make this stop. My dears, God listens. Not always in the way we expect, not always in the time we desire, but He listens." And that night, when everything seemed lost, when darkness was about to swallow me completely, He answered, in a way that would change my life forever. Kneeling on that cold floor, I could feel every grain of dust cutting into my already raw knees. Scars were forming over scars in layers that time would never completely erase. But that night in 1956, something was different in the air. Grandpa Jerome had a gleam in his eyes I had never seen before. A fire that wasn't from God. It couldn't be. His hands trembled as he held the Bible, that same worn, black-covered Bible he used as both shield and sword. "Repeat after me, Betty." His voice came out broken, almost feverish. "I am a serpent like Eve. I bring perdition to holy men." I repeated the words like a robot, as I had learned to do over the past years. My voice no longer seemed like mine. It was hollow, distant, as if coming from another body. That's how I survived, by separating my soul from what was happening to my body, like watching everything from a distance, floating on the ceiling of that dark kitchen. "Louder!" he shouted, slamming the Bible on the table with such force that the oil lamp trembled, making shadows dance on the walls like demons. "God needs to hear your confession." I raised my volume, but something inside me resisted, a small spark that all that terror hadn't managed to extinguish. 16 years old, and my eyes already carried the weariness of an entire lifetime. On those horrible nights, he had a script that he religiously followed. The irony of that word doesn't escape me. First came the accusations. I was impure, provocative, full of malice. Then the prayers in strange languages, words that seemed to choke in his throat. Finally, the forced confession. I had to admit to crimes I didn't commit, sins I didn't even know how to name. "Do you know what happens to daughters of Eve who don't repent?" he asked, coming so close to me that I could feel his hot, sour breath of old coffee. They burn forever in eternal fire." He picked up the oil lamp, raised it to my face. The flame danced dangerously close to my hair. "Feel that heat. It's just a sample of what awaits you if you don't purify that soul." I closed my eyes, held my breath. I had learned that sometimes it was best not to react. Any reaction could inflame him more, like throwing gasoline on a fire. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he roared, yanking my chin up forcefully. I opened my eyes, and what I saw froze me inside. It wasn't my grandfather anymore. It was something else, something that lived inside him, something that used religion as a disguise for a darkness deeper than any night. "Now," he whispered, placing the lamp back on the table, "we'll move on to the most important part, the purification." This was the part that terrified me the most. Each time, he invented a new type of purification. Sometimes it was hours on my knees until my legs went completely numb. Other times, it was reciting entire chapters of the Bible without missing a word. Each error meant a slap. I had been forced to take cold baths in the middle of the night to cool sinful thoughts. I had spent entire nights standing in the yard in the rain so that the water from heaven could wash my soul. But that night, something told me it would be worse. Much worse. "Stand up," he ordered. I obeyed, my legs trembling so much they barely supported me. My knees were raw, staining the hem of my white cotton nightgown red. "Do you know why we're here tonight?" he asked, circling me like a predator. "Because I saw you today. I saw how you looked at Tommy when he passed by with the hay wagon. I saw the smile. I saw the sin in your eyes." Tommy was Mr. Anderson's youngest son, our neighbor. He was 20, and yes, we had exchanged an innocent smile when he passed by our house that afternoon. A smile, nothing more. In a normal world, it would be nothing. In the world controlled by my grandfather, it was a sentence. "I didn't do anything wrong," I murmured, and immediately knew I had made a terrible mistake. His hand hit my face with such force that I staggered backward, almost falling. The metallic taste of blood filled my mouth where my teeth had cut the inside of my cheek. "Are you calling me a liar?" he growled. "Are you saying the man of God is wrong?" "No, no," I hastened to say, fear taking over every cell in my body. "I'm sorry. You're right. I sinned." His face softened a bit, satisfied with my submission. That's how it worked. Any resistance only made things worse. I had learned the art of bending without breaking, of yielding without completely losing myself. "Good," he said. "Now we're going to cleanse that sin. Today we'll do something different." He went to the kitchen cabinet, that old one made of cracked wood that held our few dishes and supplies. He opened the bottom drawer and took out something I couldn't immediately identify in the dim light. When he turned around, I saw it was a large, heavy pair of scissors, the kind used to cut fabric. "Your hair," he said, approaching. "It's your vanity, your instrument of seduction. We're going to end that." My hair was the only thing I took pride in. Black, thick, long to my waist. My mother always said it was just like my paternal grandmother's when she was young, before she died of a heart attack. It was the only physical connection I had with this grandmother I never knew. The only physical inheritance I received from her. "Please," I begged, tears instantly springing forth. "Please, no." "On your knees," he ordered, ignoring my plea. "And thank God for this act of purification." I knelt again on that unforgiving floor, my whole body trembling. He positioned himself behind me, and I closed my eyes, feeling the hot tears flowing down my face, contrasting with the cold I felt inside. The sound of the scissors cutting the first strands was like a scream in the silent night. Each cut, each lock falling to the floor, was like losing a piece of myself. It wasn't just hair. It was dignity, identity, the last thing that was truly mine. "Repeat after me," he said between cuts. "I thank God for freeing me from vanity. I thank God for purifying me." And I repeated, my voice choked with tears, while he transformed my hair into an irregular heap, cutting so close in some places that the scissors scraped my scalp, leaving small cuts that stung. When he finished, he took a broken mirror that hung on the wall and placed it in front of me. "Look at yourself now. Less tempting, isn't it? Less dangerous." The image I saw, I almost didn't recognize. A girl with frightened eyes, a face stained with tears and blood, hair destroyed as if she had been attacked by a wild animal. Some parts were almost to the root, others still had a few inches. It was a nightmare vision. "Thank me," he demanded. "Thank you," I murmured, unable to look at that broken reflection anymore. He set the mirror aside and knelt in front of me, his eyes now having that strange gleam again. Something beyond satisfaction for having purified me. "Now comes the most important part," he said, his voice changing to something lower, more intimate, that made my stomach turn. "The true purification." It was at that moment that I knew all the previous horrors had been merely the prelude, that the real hell was just beginning. He raised his hand, touched my face in a way no grandfather should touch a granddaughter. His fingers moved down my neck, stopping at the collar of my nightgown. Such a young body, so full of sin, he murmured, more to himself than to me. It needs to be completely purified. I closed my eyes, feeling so dirty, so powerless, so small in the face of that evil disguised as holiness. At that moment, all the religious teaching he had forced me to swallow over the years revealed itself for what it really was. It wasn't God speaking through him. It was something much, much darker. God, I prayed silently without moving my lips. If you truly exist, if you are listening to me, please get me out of here. Any way possible, it doesn't matter how. His fingers began to unbutton my nightgown, and I prepared for the worst. I had heard stories of other girls in the village, whispers about uncles, stepfathers, neighbors, stories that ended with lowered gazes and incomplete sentences. Now I would understand what was behind those silences. "You'll thank me," he whispered, his hot, sour breath against my face. "You'll thank me for saving your soul." And then, as if my silent prayer had been heard, something happened. First, it was a spasm. His hands, which were holding my nightgown, suddenly gripped the fabric with an abnormal force. His eyes widened, no longer with that predatory gleam, but with something new. Surprise, confusion. "What is—" he began, but the word got stuck in his throat. His left hand released my nightgown and went to his chest, clutching his shirt as if trying to pull something out from inside him. His face, previously flushed with unhealthy excitement, was quickly turning pale, then taking on a bluish tint. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, seeking air that wouldn't come. I backed away, still on my knees, watching the scene with a mixture of terror and fascination. He staggered backward, knocking over the chair, his hand still clutching his chest tightly, his eyes now filled with panic. He tried to speak again, but all that came out was a strangled sound. Then, with a thud that seemed to shake the whole house, he fell. I didn't move for several seconds, perhaps minutes. I just stayed there, looking at the body of my tormentor sprawled on the kitchen floor, the weak light of the oil lamp casting grotesque shadows over his contorted face. When I finally found the strength to approach, I touched his neck, looking for a pulse as I had seen my mother do when my little brother got very sick once. There was nothing. No pulse, no movement, no breathing. Grandpa Jerome, the man who for years had been the devil disguised as an angel in my life, was dead. A massive heart attack, the doctor would later say, who rarely came to those parts. I looked at my hands, then at the body, then at the sky I could see through the little kitchen window. A starry sky, indifferent to the drama that had just unfolded beneath its dark mantle. "Was it you?" I whispered to the distant stars. "Was it you who answered my prayer?" There was no response, of course, just the silence of the night, the wind whispering in the leaves of the apple tree in the yard, the distant hoot of an owl. But at that moment, kneeling on the cold floor with my destroyed hair fallen around me like a macabre offering, with my tormentor's body stretched out in front of me, I knew that somehow my desperate prayer had reached divine ears, that at the exact moment when evil was about to reach its peak, an invisible hand had intervened. I didn't move for a long time. I didn't call for help. I didn't scream. I just stayed there, processing what had happened, trying to understand what it meant for me, for my life, for my faith that had been so damaged. What do you do when your prayer for salvation is answered with someone's death? How do you feel when your tormentor falls dead at your feet at the exact moment he was about to commit the worst of his crimes? Gratitude? Terror? Guilt? Relief? It was all of these mixed in a whirlwind that left me dizzy, confused, lost among feelings I couldn't fully name. When the first ray of sunlight came through the window, illuminating the body on the floor with a golden, almost sacred light, I finally stood up. My legs were numb, my knees raw. I touched my destroyed hair, feeling the irregular parts, the cuts on my scalp. And then I did something I hadn't truly done in years. I prayed. Not the mechanical, empty prayers he forced me to repeat. Not the desperate pleas for salvation. It was a different prayer, a real conversation with whatever divine force might be listening. "I don't know if it was you who did this," I whispered, looking at the body on the floor. I don't know if I should thank you or ask forgiveness. I don't know what this makes me, but if it was you, thank you. And please show me the way now, because I am lost." Then I went out to the yard, to the fresh morning air, leaving behind the cold body and the darkness of the kitchen. The sun was rising over the Blue Ridge Mountains, tinting the world gold and pink as if nothing had happened, as if the night hadn't brought death and liberation in the same terrible package. I sat on the old log we used as a bench under the apple tree and waited for my parents to return from work, waited for life to decide what it would do with me now. And as I waited, something strange happened inside me, a sensation I didn't immediately recognize because it had been stolen from me so long ago. Peace. A fragile, uncertain peace, mixed with guilt and confusion, but still peace. For the first time in years, there wasn't a monster waiting in the shadows. There would be no more nights on my knees on the cold floor. There would be no more humiliation rituals. There would be no more of those eyes following me around the house, measuring every movement, looking for sins in every gesture. I was free, and as the sun rose in the sky, bathing my face marked by the tears and terror of the previous night, something else was born within me, as fragile as a sprout after a long drought, but equally persistent. Hope. The hope that perhaps God really did exist, not the cruel and vengeful God of Grandpa Jerome, but something different, something that had heard the silent cry of a terrified girl and had answered in the only way possible at that moment. It was a beginning, a bloody, traumatic beginning marked by horror, but still a beginning. The first day of a life that, although I didn't know it yet, would be long enough to find healing, peace, and eventually even forgiveness. My grandfather's body lay stretched out on that kitchen floor for almost 2 hours before my parents arrived. 2 hours in which I didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat in the yard watching the sun rise in the sky as if it were any ordinary day. I heard my mother's scream before I even saw her, a scream that tore through the morning silence like lightning, followed by my father's hurried footsteps. I didn't move. I knew they needed to find me on their own, needed to piece together that macabre puzzle. "Betty! Betty!" My mother's voice was pure panic as she ran through the yard. When she saw me sitting under the apple tree, she stopped abruptly. Her eyes took in my destroyed hair, my nightgown stained with blood from my knees, my face swollen from the slap. "My God, child, what happened? Your grandfather—" "He's dead." "Yes," I completed, with a voice that didn't seem like mine, a voice too calm, too distant. "He had an attack during the night." My father appeared right behind her, his face a mask of shock and confusion. "What did you do, Betty? What did you do to my father?" The accusation hit me like a slap, but no harder than the ones I had already received. I didn't defend myself. I just looked at him with those same empty eyes I had developed as protection. I didn't do anything. It was his heart. "Doctor, Matthews can confirm when he comes." My father advanced, his fists clenched, his face contorted in a mixture of pain and anger. For a moment, I thought he was going to hit me, continue where his father had left off. But my mother stepped in front of him. "Look at her, George. Look at the state of her. What did that old man do to our daughter?" It was the first time I heard my mother refer to my grandfather as that old man, not as Mr. Jerome or your father, when speaking to my father. Something had changed the moment she saw me in that state. My father stopped, looking at me, really seeing me for the first time in years. He saw the brutally cut hair, the raw knees, the empty eyes of a girl who had seen things no child should see. "What did he do to you?" he asked, his voice now choked, a mixture of fear and belated understanding. I didn't respond immediately. How to explain years of terror in words? How to describe the nights on my knees on the cold floor, the humiliations, the forced prayers, the constant fear? How to make him understand what his own father had become? "He purified me," I finally said, the word coming out like poison from my mouth. Every night, for years, my father staggered as if he had been punched. He leaned against the trunk of the apple tree, his face pale, his eyes wide. My mother knelt in front of me, taking my hands in hers. "What kind of purification, child?" she asked, though I could see in her eyes that she already suspected the answer. "On my knees," I responded, my gaze fixed on some point beyond her, beyond that yard, beyond that life. He made me kneel for hours, forced me to pray, to repent for sins he invented. He said I was impure, that I tempted him, that it was my fault. My voice faltered for the first time. The tears that hadn't come all night and morning finally overflowed. My mother pulled me into her arms, holding me against her chest, her own body shaking with sobs. My baby girl. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why did you keep all this to yourself? I pulled away a little, looking directly into her eyes. Would you have believed me? Would you have believed the word of a girl against that of the great man of God? She didn't respond, and her silence was answer enough. No, they wouldn't have believed me. They would have thought I was exaggerating, making up stories, being rebellious. They would have punished me for speaking ill of old Jerome, the respected patriarch, the man who carried the Bible under his arm. My father still hadn't moved. He seemed petrified, leaning against the apple tree, his eyes going from my destroyed hair to the house where his father's body lay in the kitchen. "What happened last night?" he finally asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "What happened to him? To his heart?" I closed my eyes for a moment, reliving the scene, his fingers on the buttons of my nightgown, the sick gleam in his eyes, the sudden spasm, the hand clutching his chest, the body falling with a dull thud. He was going to do something worse, I responded simply, something he had never done before. And then he fell, as if an invisible hand had struck his heart. My mother made the sign of the cross, murmuring a prayer. My father covered his face with his hands, his broad shoulders shaking in silent crying. The next hours passed as if in a strange dream. Dr. Matthews came, confirmed what I already knew. Massive heart attack. There were no marks of violence on the body besides some scratches on the hands, easily explained by the fall. The doctor looked at me, at my condition, and I saw in his eyes that he understood more than he was saying. "The girl needs care," he said to my parents before leaving, physical and other kinds. The funeral was 2 days later, a small ceremony, just family and a few neighbors. The pastor from the local church, who had so often praised my grandfather's devotion, spoke about how he was a man of God, an example of faith, a pillar of the community. I stayed in the back, using a scarf to cover my destroyed hair, eyes downcast, mind far away. Nobody asked why I didn't cry. Nobody except Mrs. Celestine, the midwife of the village, an elderly woman who had brought almost all the children of that region into the world, including me. "Death sometimes brings freedom, doesn't it, girl?" she whispered when she came to offer her condolences, her wise, ancient eyes seeing much more than others did. "Don't blame yourself for the relief you feel. Some people only bring darkness, even while carrying the Bible." I looked at her, surprised. How did she know? How could she see what even my own parents hadn't noticed for years? "I have old eyes, but they see well," she answered, as if reading my thoughts. "I saw how he looked at you. I saw how you withered when he was around. I saw the bruised knees, the dead eyes. I should have done something. Forgive me for not doing anything." At that moment, something broke inside me, not from pain, but from relief. Someone had seen, someone knew. I wasn't crazy. I hadn't imagined the horror. It was real. And someone besides me knew it. "It wasn't your fault," I responded, my voice trembling. "It wasn't anyone's fault, except his." She squeezed my hand, a gentle touch such as I hadn't felt in a long time. "And now he has been judged by a power greater than any of us. Rebuild your life, girl. Don't let what he did define who you are." In the weeks that followed, life in our house completely changed. The back room where my grandfather had lived was emptied. His things burned in the yard in a kind of purification ritual that my mother conducted in silence. His Bible, the one that had been used as a weapon against me for so many years, was the last thing to go into the fire. "This is not the word of God," my mother said, as the flames consumed the worn pages. "It's the devil's hiding place." My father took longer to recover, not just from his father's death, but from the revelation of who he really was. For weeks he could barely look at me, carrying a guilt that curved him like a physical weight. One night, almost a month after the funeral, he entered the room I shared with my siblings, sat on the edge of my bed, his large, calloused hands resting uncertainly on his knees. "Betty," he began, his voice hoarse as one who had been crying, I will never forgive myself for not protecting you, for not seeing what was happening under my own roof. I looked at him in the dark, seeing not the strong man he had always been in my eyes, but a man broken by the weight of truth. It wasn't your fault, Dad. He fooled everyone. He was good at it. It was my duty to protect you, he insisted, his voice breaking. And I failed. I let that monster do what he did to you while I worked, thinking everything was fine, that you were safe. That night, for the first time, I told him everything, every detail of the years of abuse, every humiliation, every night on my knees on the cold floor. And for the first time, my father cried openly in front of me, great sobs that shook his strong body like storms. When I finished, he did something he hadn't done since I was very small. He hugged me. An awkward, timid hug from someone who doesn't know if he has the right to offer comfort after failing so terribly. But still a hug. We're going to get through this, he promised, his voice firm despite the tears. We're going to heal this family, and no one will ever hurt you like this again, daughter. Never again. In the months that followed, our family underwent a slow transformation. The ghost of my grandfather still lingered in the corners of the house, but each day it grew a little weaker, a little more distant. My hair began to grow back, irregular at first, then more uniform. My mother trimmed the ends to make it more presentable, and each inch that grew was like a small victory over the past. I returned to school, to the surprise of many in the village who didn't understand why a girl of almost 17 needed education. You're going to be somebody in life, my father would now say. You're going to be free, independent. You won't need any man to support you. Words I never thought I'd hear from him. A man raised in the fields with traditional ideas about a woman's role. But tragedy changes people, sometimes for the better. The healing wasn't linear or quick. There were days when I woke up screaming, reliving the horrors in my sleep. There were moments when a man would pass too close to me on the street, and I would freeze in terror. There were Sundays when I couldn't enter the church because the smell of incense reminded me of the forced purifications. But there were also good days, days when I laughed with my schoolmates, when I helped my mother in the kitchen and didn't feel afraid, when I looked at the sky and didn't wonder if God hated me. When I turned 18, I started working as an assistant at the village pharmacy. A simple job, organizing shelves, attending to customers, learning about medicines and herbs. It was there that I met John, a 20-year-old young man who had come from Richmond to work as the pharmacist's apprentice. John was different from any man I had known, gentle, respectful, never invasive. He courted me for months with a patience that confused me. I wasn't used to men who asked permission, who waited, who respected boundaries. Our first kiss only happened after almost a year of dating. We were sitting by the river that runs through Millbrook, under the shade of a tree. He held my hand, looked into my eyes. "May I kiss you, Betty?" he asked, his voice trembling with nervousness. That simple request, that question that showed respect for my body, for my choice, moved me more than any declaration of love could have. I nodded, unable to speak, and when his lips touched mine, soft and hesitant, I didn't feel fear. For the first time, a masculine touch didn't cause me terror. John didn't know everything, not yet. He only knew that I had lost my grandfather tragically, that I had gone through difficult times. The complete story would only come years later, when the trust between us was deep enough. We married in 1962, when I was 22 and he was 24, a simple ceremony in the local church. Yes, I had returned to attending church, albeit in a different way, more personal, less ritualistic. I discovered that my faith hadn't been destroyed by my grandfather, only buried, waiting for the right moment to resurface, purified by the fire of trial. On our wedding night, John noticed my terror. How could he not? I trembled like a leaf in the wind when we were alone in the small room we had rented. "We won't do anything you don't want," he said, sitting at a safe distance on the edge of the bed. "We can just sleep if you prefer. We have our whole lives ahead of us." That night we just slept, embraced, dressed, and the next night too, and the next. John never pressured, never demanded, never made me feel less for not being able to. It was only in our 3rd month of marriage that I felt ready to try, and even then it was difficult, it was painful, not physically, but emotionally. The memories mixed with the present. The shadow of my grandfather sometimes hovered over us like a stubborn ghost, but John had infinite patience. He stopped the instant I asked, always asked, before touching me in a new way, kept the lights on so I could see it was him, always him, never the monster from my nightmares. Our first daughter was born in 1964. We named her Celeste in honor of Mrs. Celestine, the midwife who had been the first to see my pain, the first to validate my suffering. When I held that small bundle in my arms, I made a silent promise. I will never let them hurt you as they hurt me. I will never let them make you feel guilty for the body you have, for the feelings you carry. Looking at her, so small, so perfect, so innocent, I finally understood on a visceral level the horror of what my grandfather had done, the perversity of using religion, authority, and fear to abuse a child, the monstrosity that hid behind the facade of a man of God. And I also understood, with a clarity that made me cry in the silence of the early morning while everyone slept, that what happened that night, the massive heart attack that took him at the exact moment he was preparing to commit his worst crime, hadn't been a coincidence. It had indeed been an intervention, a brutal miracle, terrible in its execution, but still a miracle. The hand of God, not the vengeful and cruel God that my grandfather preached, but a God of justice and protection, had descended upon that dark kitchen and had said, "Enough." This understanding didn't bring joy. It didn't bring satisfaction. It brought a solemn acceptance, a deep understanding that there are forces greater than us operating in ways we cannot fully comprehend. And it also brought the certainty that despite everything I suffered, I wasn't alone in that suffering. Someone or something was with me, even in the darkest nights. I never saw my grandfather in my dreams after Celeste's birth. The nightmares finally ceased, replaced by ordinary dreams, sometimes even happy ones. It was as if that chapter of my life had finally closed. The last page turned. The brutal miracle that freed me that night wasn't just the death of my tormentor. It was also the birth of a new Betty, one who slowly, painfully, was learning not to be afraid, not to feel guilty, not to carry the weight of sins that were never hers. A Betty who, despite the scars, some visible, most not, had found her way back to the light. Motherhood brought to my life a light I never imagined possible. When I held little Celeste in my arms, feeling the warmth of her little body against my chest, the whole world seemed to make more sense, as if after years in darkness, I had finally found the door to a sunny garden. But the shadows of the past have long claws. Even in the happiest moments, I would sometimes find myself paralyzed by sudden fears. What if I wasn't a good mother? What if the years of abuse had broken something fundamental inside me? What if I didn't know how to protect my daughter from the evil that exists in the world? Celeste had just turned 2 when I had my first major collapse. It was an ordinary afternoon. I was hanging clothes on the clothesline in the yard while she played with a rag doll. Suddenly, without warning, a wave of memories hit me with such force that my knees gave way. I fell sitting on the ground, my hands trembling, cold sweat running down my face, unable to breathe. They were fragments of the night my grandfather died. His fingers on the buttons of my nightgown, his heavy breathing, the sick gleam in his eyes, and then the spasm, the surprise, the body falling heavily on the kitchen floor. "Mommy? Mommy fall?" The worried little voice of Celeste brought me back. She was in front of me, her big eyes wide, the doll forgotten on the ground. I took a deep breath, forced a smile. "Mommy just rested a little bit, my love. Everything's fine." But nothing was fine. The relief I felt at my grandfather's death, that deep, visceral, immediate relief, was eating me from inside like acid. What kind of person feels relief when someone dies? What kind of Christian thanks God for taking a life, even if it's the life of her tormentor? These questions haunted me on sleepless nights. While John and Celeste slept peacefully beside me, I would look at the dark ceiling, feeling the weight of guilt crushing my chest. Not guilt for what had happened. I knew rationally that I hadn't caused my grandfather's death, but guilt for being grateful, guilt because in my darkest moments, I thought he deserved that end. John noticed something was wrong, of course. My husband always had a special sensitivity to my moods. even before knowing the whole story. "What's going on, Betty?" he asked one night after putting Celeste to bed and finding me sitting in the dark on the porch, staring at nothing. "You seem distant lately." It was then that I told him everything for the first time since that night in 1956. I narrated in detail the horror I had lived through for years, the raw knees on the cold floor, the forced prayers, the humiliations, the invented sins. And I also told him about the final night, about how my grandfather fell dead at the exact moment he was about to commit his worst crime. John listened in silence, his face contorted in a mask of horror and compassion. When I finished, he didn't say anything for several minutes, just held my hands in his, caressing my fingers as if trying to warm something that had cooled long ago. "Do you think it was wrong to feel relief?" he finally asked, his voice low, gentle. "I don't know," I confessed, tears now flowing freely. "The Bible says we should forgive, that we shouldn't wish ill on others. But I prayed for it to end, for something, anything, to free me. And then it happened." John took a deep breath, looking at the starry sky above us. "Betty, I think God understands the heart of the desperate better than we understand ourselves. You didn't cause his death. You weren't to blame. But I was happy, John," I confessed in a whisper, finally putting into words what tormented me the most. "When I realized he was dead, that he would never hurt me again, never force me to kneel, never call me impure again, I felt such great joy that it scared me." He squeezed my hands, looking directly into my eyes. "That doesn't make you a bad person, my love. It makes you human. Who wouldn't feel relief after years of torture? Who wouldn't be thankful to be free?" That conversation was the beginning of a long and painful journey to reconcile my faith with my experience, my relief with my guilt. John suggested we talk to the new pastor who had come to the church, a young man with more progressive ideas, who didn't carry the weight of the rigid fundamentalism that had shaped the faith of the previous generation. Pastor Gabriel received us in his small office on a Sunday afternoon after the service. He was a thin man with round glasses and a gentle look, different from any religious leader I had known before. I told my story once more, the words coming a little easier this time, though they still hurt like open wounds. When I got to the part about the relief, about the guilt I felt for being grateful for my grandfather's death, I stopped, expecting to see judgment in his eyes. Instead, I saw compassion and something more, a deep understanding that caught me by surprise. "Betty," he said, leaning forward in his chair, his hands joined as if in prayer. "Do you know the story of David and Goliath?" I nodded. Of course I knew it. It was one of the stories my grandfather told before everything began, when he was still just my grandfather and not my tormentor. "David celebrated Goliath's death," continued Pastor Gabriel. "He not only celebrated it, he gave thanks to God for it, because that death meant liberation for his people. It meant the end of oppression, of fear." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The Bible is full of stories where divine intervention results in the death of oppressors. What happened that night in your kitchen, some would call coincidence, others divine justice. I prefer to think it was God's hand protecting one of his most vulnerable daughters at the moment when she needed it most." Something inside me loosened with those words. A knot I had carried for years began to slowly, painfully unravel. It wasn't an instant cure. Nothing in real life works that way. It was the beginning of a process, the first step of a long and difficult climb back to the light. In the months that followed that conversation, I began to do something I had never done before: study the Bible on my own. Not the selected passages from my grandfather to make me feel dirty and guilty, but the book as a whole, with its contradictions, its beauties, its stories of fall and redemption. I found comfort in characters who weren't perfect: David, who committed adultery; Moses, who killed a man; Peter, who denied Christ; flawed, human people who were still loved and used by God. And I found a passage that would become my anchor in moments of doubt. Romans 8:28. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." All things, even the terrible ones, even those we don't fully understand, even those that leave us with conflicting feelings of relief and guilt. In 1966, our second child was born. Gabriel, yes, in honor of the pastor who had been an instrument of so much healing in my life. A boy with bright eyes and an easy smile, so different from the grandfather whose name we never mentioned at home. Motherhood, which had begun as a frightening challenge with Celeste, now became a source of healing, of purpose. Each hug I gave my children, each goodnight kiss, each story told under the blanket, all of this was an act of rebellion against the past, an affirmation that the cycle of abuse had been broken. With John, we built a family based on respect, on genuine love, on faith that liberates instead of religion that imprisons. Our home was the opposite of the one where I grew up, full of laughter, of music, of honest conversations. Of course, it wasn't perfect. We had our problems, our arguments, our difficult moments. We went through financial difficulties when the pharmacy where John worked closed in 1970. We faced little Gabriel's illness, pneumonia that almost took him at age 4. We lived through the pains and joys common to any family. But there was a fundamental difference. We faced everything together, as partners, as equals. There was no fear between us, no constant feeling of walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion. There were just imperfect people trying to do the best they could for each other. In 1975, at 35, I did something I had never imagined possible. I went back to school, an evening course to complete high school, attended mainly by young people who worked during the day. I was easily the oldest in the class, except for the math teacher. "It's never too late to start over," he said when he saw me hesitant at the classroom door on the first day. "Knowledge has no age." It was difficult at first. My brain seemed rusty after so many years away from books, but there was a hunger inside me, a thirst for learning that not even the years of abuse had been able to completely extinguish. John would take care of the children on the nights I went to school. Celeste, at 11, already helped with her 9-year-old brother, proud to be the woman of the house while Mommy studied. "I want to be smart like you when I grow up," she told me one night as she watched me do my homework at the kitchen table. "I want to study and be someone important." Those words hit me like a ray of light. That was it. That was exactly why I was there, breaking all expectations, all the molds that society had for a woman of my age, of my background. It wasn't just for me. It was for Celeste, to show her that a woman could be more than a wife and mother, that she could dream, learn, grow, no matter what she had been through, no matter how many years she had. When I graduated in 1977, my whole family was there. John, Celeste, Gabriel, and even my elderly parents, proud in a way I had never seen before, especially my father, who cried openly when I received my diploma. He, who had never had the opportunity to study beyond elementary school, who had spent his life working in the fields to support the family. "You did it, daughter," he said, hugging me tightly after the ceremony. "You did what no one in our family ever did." It was a moment of culmination, of achievement, but also of forgiveness, not for my grandfather, whose acts were unforgivable, but for my father, who hadn't been able to protect me, and for myself, for all the years I had believed the lies, when I had felt dirty, guilty, impure. That diploma represented more than formal education. It represented freedom, self-determination, the ability to rewrite my own story. The following year, I got a job as an administrative assistant at the Millbrook Town Hall. A simple job, but one that gave me financial independence for the first time in my life. My first paycheck was a revelation, money I had earned with my own effort, my own ability. "What are you going to do with it?" John asked when I brought the envelope home, his eyes shining with pride. I thought for a moment, savoring the feeling of choice, of power. "I'm going to save half for the children's education, and with the other half I'm going to buy books. Lots of books." And so I did. Our house, which had always been simple but welcoming, began to accumulate improvised shelves full of books of all kinds: history, literature, science, philosophy, classics and contemporaries, novels and essays. I read voraciously, like someone trying to recover lost time, and encouraged my children to do the same. "Knowledge is the only thing no one can take from you," I always said. "You can lose everything in life, but what's in here," and I would point to my head, "goes with you wherever you go." Celeste followed in my footsteps, becoming an avid reader. Gabriel preferred sports, but still developed the habit of reading at least a little every night before bed. Our house became an environment of constant learning, of stimulating discussions, of intellectual growth. It was during this time, in the late 70s, that I finally made peace with the past, not in the sense of forgiving the unforgivable, but of accepting that what had happened was part of my story, not the whole story. That the horror of those years had shaped me, yes, but didn't completely define me. On a particularly significant afternoon, I visited the cemetery where my grandfather was buried. I hadn't been there since the funeral, more than 20 years before. The grave was abandoned, covered with weeds, the simple headstone almost illegible under the moss. I didn't feel anger looking at that forgotten grave. I didn't feel fear or hatred or even that corrosive guilt that had accompanied me for so long. I just felt peace, a surprising, unexpected peace, like cool water after a long walk in the desert. "You didn't win," I said in a low voice to the wind, to the trees, to the past. "You tried to destroy me, but I'm here, whole, alive, loved. You turned to dust, and I blossomed." At that moment, I finally understood that the relief I felt at his death wasn't sin. It was survival. It was my spirit clinging to life, choosing light instead of darkness. And if God had intervened that night, as I deeply believed he had, then my relief was just the echo of divine justice itself. I left the cemetery feeling lighter than I had in decades, as if I had finally put down a burden I had carried for so long it had become part of my own body. I returned home, to my family, to the books, to the life I had built from the ashes of that terrible night. An imperfect life, with its ups and downs, its pains and joys, but a life of my own, chosen, not imposed. A life of possibilities, not limitations. The relief and guilt that for so long had battled inside me finally found a balance, not through forgetting, I never forgot, never could, but through acceptance, through the understanding that contradictory feelings can coexist, that we can carry multiple truths at the same time. I could feel relief at my tormentor's death and still be a good person. I could thank God for the intervention that saved me and still be a genuine Christian. I could remember the horror and still choose joy, life, love. And so step by step, day after day, I rebuilt not just my life, but my relationship with the divine. A relationship based not on fear, guilt, or punishment, but on love, grace, acceptance. A God who didn't demand perfection from me, just honesty. Who didn't want me on my knees on the cold floor, but standing strong, looking to the future with hope. A God who, on that terrible night in 1956, had heard the desperate cry of a terrified girl and had answered in the only way possible at that moment, with a brutal miracle, terrible in its execution, but perfect in its timing. An intervention that, seen through the lenses of time and maturity, revealed itself as what it really was, love in its purest, fiercest, most protective form. And for this, I could finally say, without guilt, without fear, with the quiet certainty of one who has found the truth in the depths of her own soul, "Thank you, Lord, for everything, even for what I didn't understand at the time, even for what seemed terrible to me, even for the brutal miracle that freed me and allowed me to be here today, telling this story." The 80s arrived, bringing winds of change to America and also to my life. Celeste, my firstborn, was preparing to apply for college, dreaming of law school. Gabriel was entering adolescence with the typical restlessness of those years, full of questions about the world, about himself. John and I completed 20 years of marriage in 1982, 2 decades of a love built stone by stone, day by day, with patience and respect. I was 42, and looking back, I hardly recognized the terrified girl I once was. The work at the town hall, the continued studies, the books we devoured as a family, all of this had transformed me into a different woman. Not perfect, not without scars, but whole in a way I didn't think possible for a long time. When Celeste was accepted to the University of Virginia, our family experienced a revolution. My daughter would be the first person in the family to enter a university. The pride I felt that day, seeing her name on the list of those accepted, published in the newspaper, is beyond words. It was you, Mom, she said, hugging me tightly after receiving the news. It was you who taught me that a woman can be whatever she wants. I swallowed the tears, held her face between my hands. No, my daughter. You did it because you're strong, intelligent, and determined. I just showed a possible path. You're the one who decided to walk it. Celeste's departure for Charlottesville was a bittersweet moment, the joy of achievement mixed with the pain of separation. We packed her few clothes in an old suitcase, pooled money for the rent of a room in a boarding house near the college. We didn't have much, but what we had, we offered with love. Remember who you are, I said to her at the bus station, holding her hands in mine. Remember where you came from. Don't let anyone make you feel less for being from a small town, for not having expensive clothes, for speaking differently. She smiled that luminous smile that always warmed my heart. I know who I am, Mom. I'm the daughter of Betty and John, granddaughter of... She hesitated, as we always did when we almost mentioned that name. I'm the granddaughter of my grandmother, whom I never knew, but who they say had the same hair as me. I hugged her tightly, feeling her young, strong body against mine. How many nights I spent awake after that day, praying for her safety, her happiness. How many times I used the public phone in the square to call the boarding house just to hear her voice for a few precious minutes. It was during this time that John began participating in a Bible study group, different from anything we had known before. It wasn't in the traditional church, but in the home of a retired university professor who had moved to Millbrook. Professor Claude, a man with a white beard and gentle eyes, who had spent years studying theology in Boston and brought a completely new approach to the scriptures. He teaches in a way that makes everything make sense, John told me one day, returning excited from one of the meetings. It's not that thing about instilling fear, talking about sin and condemnation all the time. It's about love, about justice, about how to live better here and now. Reluctant at first, I still carried deep scars related to religion. I eventually agreed to accompany him to one of the meetings. It was a June night, the cold mountain air coming through the windows of the simple but welcoming living room of the professor's house. I sat in the corner, observing the small group, about 10 people of diverse ages and backgrounds. A housewife, a carpenter, a nurse from the health center, a young teacher from the local school, ordinary people with real questions, seeking answers that made sense in their everyday lives. Professor Claude began by talking about the Beatitudes, those famous phrases of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, but he presented them in a way I had never heard before. When Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," he is not glorifying poverty or suffering, he explained, his eyes shining behind his round glasses. He is announcing a reversal in the order of the world. He is saying that those whom society considers weak, marginalized, worthless, are precisely the ones who are at the center of God's kingdom. Something awakened inside me with those words. A spark of recognition, of understanding. For years I had felt exactly like that. Marginalized, weak, worthless. First because of my grandfather's abuses, then because of the guilt I carried, then because of the limited expectations society had for a woman of my origin and position. Jesus was turning the tables, continued the professor. He was challenging the oppressive religious system of his time, which used God to control, to terrorize, to keep people, especially the most vulnerable, in constant submission. My eyes filled with tears. That was exactly what my grandfather had done, used God, used religion as tools of control and terror. And here was this white-bearded man saying that Jesus was on the other side, against this kind of abuse. After the study, when everyone was having tea and conversing in small groups, I approached the professor timidly. Do you really believe that God is not as the rigid religious people paint him? I asked, my voice almost a whisper. He looked at me with such a deep understanding that it made me think he somehow knew what had happened to me, knew about the nights on my knees on the cold floor, the forced prayers, the terror in the name of God. I believe with all certainty, my daughter, he responded, his voice gentle but firm. The God I know, whom I've studied for decades, is a God of love, of justice, of liberation. He is a God who is always on the side of victims, never of oppressors. He is a God who brings down the powerful from their thrones and lifts up the humble, as Mary's canticle says. That night, I returned home with something new growing inside me. A faith different from what I had known in childhood, different even from what I had rebuilt in the years after the brutal miracle. A more mature, more conscious, more liberating faith. I began attending the weekly studies, absorbing every word, every new perspective. I learned about liberation theology, about how the scriptures could be read from the perspective of the oppressed. I learned that Jesus was more concerned with social justice than with religious rituals, more interested in genuine love than in blind obedience. It was as if a light had been lit in a room that had remained in shadow for my entire life. Not only could I reconcile my faith with my experience, I could see that my own journey of liberation was deeply aligned with the central message of the gospel. In 1985, something unexpected happened. Professor Claude, already with his health debilitated by advanced age, called me for a private conversation. "Betty," he said, sitting in his rocking chair, an open book in his lap, "I want you to take over leadership of the study group when I no longer can." I was paralyzed with shock. Me, a woman with no formal theological training, with only a high school diploma completed late, leading a Bible study group. "But Professor, I don't have the preparation for this," I protested. "I didn't study in seminary. I don't know Greek or Hebrew." He smiled that smile that radiated wisdom and kindness. "Neither did the disciples, my daughter. They were fishermen, tax collectors, ordinary people. What you have is much more valuable than academic titles. You have life experience, you have a thirst for knowledge, you have a heart that has known suffering and yet has chosen love." I swallowed hard, unable to respond immediately. It was such a great vote of confidence, such a serious responsibility. "Besides," he added with a twinkle in his eyes, "you read more than anyone I know. I doubt anyone in the group has devoured as many theology books as you have in recent years." It was true. Since I began attending the studies, I had immersed myself in books the professor lent me. Contemporary theologians who wrote about a God of love and justice, scholars who analyzed the scriptures in their original historical context, thinkers who questioned traditional interpretations that had been used to oppress and control. "Think about it," he said, taking my hand. "You don't need to answer now, but know that you have a special calling, Betty. Your story, your journey isn't just for you. It's to be shared, to help others who are trapped in the same religious snares that almost destroyed you." I left that conversation trembling, not with fear, but with an emotion I couldn't fully name. Could it be possible? Could I, who had been so brutally silenced in the name of religion, now use my voice to liberate others? I talked to John that night, lying in our simple bed, the old fan lazily turning on the ceiling. "You should accept," he said without hesitation. "You have so much to offer, Betty. Your strength, your wisdom, your faith that survived the worst kind of abuse." I accepted the proposal the following week. Professor Claude began training me, passing on his knowledge, his books, his notes accumulated over decades of study. It was an intense period of learning, of growth, of discoveries. When he passed away 6 months later, I took over the group with a heart heavy from the loss, but strengthened by the confidence he had placed in me. The group had grown to almost 20 people, including some young women who came seeking a spirituality that didn't diminish them, that didn't blame them simply for being women. For them especially, I spoke, shared not just the theological knowledge I had acquired, but also my own story. Not all the dark details, but enough for them to understand that I knew the pain of religious oppression, that I had survived it, that I had found a way back to a faith that liberated instead of imprisoning. "God is not what violent men say he is," I would always repeat. "God is on the side of victims, not oppressors. God cries when we suffer. He is furious when we are mistreated in his name." In the years that followed, our group became a refuge for many in Millbrook, people who had been hurt by traditional churches, who carried guilt imposed by authoritarian religious leaders, who sought a more authentic and less oppressive spirituality. We weren't a church in the traditional sense. We didn't have hierarchy, rigid dogmas, or mandatory rituals. We were just people seeking together, learning together, growing together. We were a spiritual family formed not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by affinity, by genuine love. In 1988, when America was debating the cultural and social shifts of the decade, Celeste graduated from law school. The ceremony was in Charlottesville, and our entire family traveled to attend. John and I, Gabriel, who was now studying engineering at Virginia Tech, even my elderly parents, determined to see their granddaughter receive her diploma. Sitting in that auditorium, watching my daughter in her cap and gown, the square hat on her head of dark hair like mine, I felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost took my breath away. How had we come this far? How had that terrible night in the dark kitchen of Millbrook given birth to this life, this family, this joy? "Thank you," I whispered, not to anyone in particular. Perhaps to God, perhaps to the universe, perhaps to myself. Thank you for surviving, for not giving up, for finding strength where there seemed to be none. Celeste surprised us at the celebratory dinner that night. "Mom, Dad," she announced, holding her boyfriend's hand, a gentle young man we had met recently. "I have some news. I've been invited to work at a nonprofit that offers free legal assistance to women victims of domestic violence." My heart stopped for a second, then accelerated. "Daughter, that's wonderful." She smiled that luminous smile that had been her trademark since childhood. "It was you who inspired me, Mom. Your stories, even the ones you told halfway, with careful words. I always knew there was something more there. Something you protected us from, to not hurt us." My eyes filled with tears. I had never told the complete details to my children. I didn't want them to carry the weight of my past. But children are intuitive. They perceive more than we show. "I want to do for others what you did for yourself," she continued, her eyes shining with determination. "I want to help women find their voice, their strength, their way back to the light after darkness." At that moment, I felt the circle closing somehow, that the suffering I had experienced hadn't been in vain, that it had transformed into something greater, something more significant, a mission that would now continue through my daughter. The 90s arrived with even greater changes. Gabriel graduated, married a charming girl from Richmond. Celeste developed nationally recognized work in defending women victims of violence. John and I, now in our 50s, continued our work in Millbrook, he as the manager of the new pharmacy that had opened in town, I dividing my time between the job at the town hall and the study group that had grown even larger. In 1997, at 57, I did something that even in my boldest dreams I hadn't imagined. I published a book. It wasn't with a major publisher, just a small printing press in Roanoke, but still, it was a book with my name on the cover. Faith Beyond Fear, Finding God After Trauma, an account of my spiritual journey without the explicit details of the abuse, but with all the emotional truth of my experience. The book circulated mainly in progressive religious groups, in NGOs that worked with victims of violence, in small alternative faith communities that sought a more authentic spirituality. I didn't get rich or famous, but I received letters, dozens of them, from women who identified with my story, who found hope in my words, who began their own healing journey after reading my account. One of those letters particularly marked me deeply. It was from a 78-year-old woman from a small town in West Virginia. "Dear Betty," she wrote in a trembling handwriting, "your book came into my hands through my granddaughter who works at an NGO. I never thought that at my age I would find words that explained what I experienced as a girl. I too was abused by a man who used the Bible as shield and sword. I too carried guilt for decades. I too had to rebuild my faith from the ashes. Thank you for showing me I'm not alone, that I never was. Thank you for giving me words for feelings I've carried in silence my entire life." I cried reading that letter. I cried for that lady, for myself, for all the girls and women who went through similar experiences. I cried from sadness for the shared suffering, but also from gratitude for the solidarity found, for the healing possible, for the strength we discovered in ourselves and in each other. When the new millennium arrived, John and I were already retired. Our children had their own families, their own homes, their own lives. We were grandparents to 5 wonderful grandchildren who filled our house with laughter during vacations and holidays. Our life had become more tranquil, more contemplative. I still coordinated the study group, now with the help of younger people who had joined us over the years. I still received letters from readers of my book, which continued circulating in small circles, passing from hand to hand like a precious secret. In 2006, I turned 66. Half a century had passed since that terrible night in the dark kitchen, when a brutal miracle changed the course of my life forever. Half a century of struggle, of reconstruction, of learning, of growth. That year, I made a personal pilgrimage. I returned to the house where I grew up, where I suffered, where I was liberated in such a dramatic way. The house had passed through many hands after my parents passed away. Now it belonged to a young family with small children. I didn't go in. I just stood on the sidewalk looking at the windows, at the door, at the roof that had been renovated, at the garden that now had swings and colorful toys. "What is it, my love?" John asked, holding my hand as we observed the house. "I'm thinking about how places change, how they transform. This house, which was the scene of so much horror, is now full of children's laughter, of new life." He squeezed my hand, perfectly understanding what I meant. "Like you, Betty, like all of us, if we give ourselves the chance, capable of transformation, of renewal, of starting over." I looked at him, at this man who had been my companion for more than 4 decades, who had loved me with patience, with respect, with constancy, who had believed in my strength when I myself doubted, who had walked beside me on the journey of reconstruction, without rushing, without judgment. "You know what surprises me the most?" I asked, as we slowly moved away from the house, back to the present, to the future. "It's not that I survived. It's that I found joy, true joy, not just the absence of pain. It's that I built a life worth living, not just enduring." He smiled that smile that, even after so many years, still made my heart beat a little faster. "You were always stronger than you think, Betty. You always had this light inside you, even in the darkest moments." Perhaps he was right. Perhaps even in those nights of terror, on my knees on the cold floor, repeating words that weren't mine, there already existed in me the seed of what I would become, the woman who survived, who rebuilt, who blossomed. Now, at 83, I look back and see a long, winding, sometimes steep path, but one that brought me exactly where I need to be. I see not just the horror of the first chapters, but all the beauty that came after, the love found, the family built, the faith rediscovered, the voice recovered. I share this story not to cause horror, nor to seek pity, but because I believe in the power of testimonies. I believe that our stories, especially the most difficult ones, can be beacons for others who are still lost in darkness. If you're watching this video and identify with any part of my journey, know that you're not alone. Know that the darkness, as dense as it may seem, is not eternal. Know that it's possible to rebuild, to be reborn, to find light and meaning even after the most devastating experiences. Before I say goodbye, I'd like to ask that if this story touched your heart, please leave a like, subscribe to the Grandparents' Tales channel to follow other stories like mine, and leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from. Life is brief, my dears. Even 83 years pass like a breath when we look back. What matters is not how long we live, but how we transform our wounds into wisdom, our suffering into compassion, our scars into bridges that connect us to each other. May God bless each one of you from the bottom of my heart, and always remember, no matter what you've been through, no matter how deep the darkness, there is a path back to the light. I found mine.